Yeah. So I founded the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development about 10 years ago. We're based in Jerusalem, and we're working to reveal the connection between religion and ecology and mobilize people to act. So we've been doing several projects over the past number of years. We organized an annual conference on religion and ecology in Jerusalem, and we've also organized with other partners 7 conferences in the United States. So we've engaged hundreds of clergy and faculty and deans at seminaries in the United States and in Israel. We also have a project in Africa called the Faith-Inspired Renewable Energy Project. So we're working with the Anglican Church in Mozambique to deploy a commercial scale solar field on church lands. And we're doing that in collaboration with Gigawatt Global, which is a renewable energy platform. We also have what we call thought leadership on religion and ecology. So we have an active Facebook page and YouTube channel and other social media channels. We're trying to get the word out and raise awareness that there is a connection between religion and ecology, and that faith people should be involved for a sustainable future.
So your personal journey, what inspired this interest in ecology? Because traditionally Orthodoxy doesn't really emphasize this interest in ecology, climate change, or any of these kinds of issues.
It's a great question. So I grew up on an acre of land with an organic garden that I gardened with my mother in Northern California. I grew up picking fruit from trees. I grew up with an old growth oak tree that the Native Americans likely harvested the acorns in the 19th century. And I grew up going to a Jewish summer camp in California near Yosemite called Camp Tawanga, and there I first learned about the connection between religion and ecology. I studied environmental issues in college. I did some research in India on renewable energy and in Mexico on genetically modified corn. And I came to Israel about 18 years ago and first studied the connection in yeshivot, in Jewish learning centers, about religion and ecology. And I started the organization based on an awareness that there's a deep connection between religion and ecology, and yet most people aren't aware of it.
So, sorry. So I was just wondering, did you grow up Orthodox?
I grew up going to a Reformed temple in the Bay Area of California called Temple Isaiah.
Okay. So the connection to religion came after the connection to ecology, it seems.
Well, I grew up both with religion and ecology. I grew up in a Jewish home where we celebrated Shabbat every Friday night.
Okay.
And with a Shabbat dinner. I grew up in a Jewish home where I learned from my mother and from my grandmother that there's something deep in Judaism. I grew up going to the summer camp where I was first introduced to the connection between religion and ecology. And I grew up with an ecological awareness. As I said, on an acre of land, I grew up growing some corn and squash and pumpkins and raspberries in our garden. I grew up picking plums and apples and figs in our orchard. I grew up next to a creek with a lot of trees. So I grew up with both Judaism and ecology, and that has sort of blossomed as I have gotten older into the work that I'm currently doing.
That's amazing. So your book, The Eco Bible, where did this idea come from, and how long did it take you to put it together?
So, I mean, the Bible has deep things to say about ecology, and this has been growing in me for several decades. About 15 years ago, I worked on a book with the Jewish environmental organization Kanfei Nesharim called Eitz Chaim Hi, which was 54 essays on the 54 weekly Torah portions in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. Following that, I edited another book with them. They're now part of Grow Torah, which is based in New Jersey. The book's called Uplifting People and Planet, 18 Essential Jewish Teachings on Ecology. And we've been working in my organization for a few years now on this book, and we just published it a few weeks ago on Amazon and Ingram, iBooks, Kobo. So it's available as a paperback and an ebook. We're also publishing it soon as a hardcover and as an audiobook. So it's been growing in me for a number of years, and the co-author is Leo D. So he's also had an important role as well as several other editors, Deb Rose, who were involved in it.
Okay, so we're just going to go over some of the ideas in the book because I think some of them are pretty revolutionary for the Jewish tradition because it's generally, I think a lot of them are not emphasized when you go to a traditional Jewish school and you learn about the Chumash and the Pentateuch. It's not really spoken about the way that it is in your book. So I found that really revelatory. So the first metaphor that I think you kind of start out the book with was the passengers on a boat. And when one passenger is drilling a hole in the boat, the other people are upset because, they know that the boat is going to sink because it's going to be filled with water. And they don't really care why this passenger is doing it, but he needs to stop doing it. So can you elaborate a little bit more on what drove you to pick that particular metaphor for the beginning of the book?
Sure. So what you just cited is a teaching from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was living about 2,000 years ago. And that teaching is recorded in the Midrash, in the Jewish oral tradition. The reason I decided to include that at the beginning of the introduction to Eco Bible is because it's one of the Jewish teachings that I think most relates to our ecological crisis. Of someone buys a ticket, they go onto a boat, and they start to drill underneath their own seat. And the other people say to them, "What are you doing?" And they say, "Well, I'm drilling underneath my own seat. I can do this." And the other people say, "Well, actually, what you're doing harms us." The reason I think it's it's like a hand in a glove for our current situation is because each of us is drilling underneath our own seat too on the collective ship we call planet Earth. And most of us are doing it for rational reasons. We turn on the lights, we want to drive somewhere, we want to eat meat, we want to fly somewhere. And so too, the person on the boat was probably doing it for a rational reason. They wanted to get some water to cool their feet. They wanted to get some water to drink if they were on a freshwater body of water. They had to go to the bathroom, all these rational reasons for doing what they did. And yet their individual action, while it's rational for them and it serves an immediate need for them, it undermines the future of everyone else on that ship. So that's why I decided to start the book, because the ecological crisis is largely unintentional. It's not like anyone wants to cause climate change. It's not like anyone wants to extinct species, but by almost 8 billion people doing small acts, that adds up. And in the aggregate, we have the ecological challenges that we're facing.
And that's similar to the people of Babel who were punished for small thefts that altogether amounted to a large one. Is that right?
That's right. So according to the Midrash, the Jewish oral tradition, the reason that Noah's generation was punished with the flood and why humanity was wiped out, except for Noah and his family, was because people would go to a market and each person would steal one peanut or one almond. And they would call the police, the vendors would call the police, and the police would show up and would ask what happened. And the police would say, "Look, I can't punish this person. I can't, give them a fine or put them in jail because the amount that they stole is just one peanut. It's less than 1 penny of wealth and value. And the justice system doesn't respond to theft at that level. So it was these small acts of evil and of wrongdoing, which is, according to the Midrash, what caused Noah's generation to be destroyed. And in our times too, it's small acts of, doing, of eating, of driving, of flying, which add up, but times billions of people to what we're facing today.
Yeah, that's for sure. So the Eco Bible talks about different relationships that humans have. And one of the relationships it talks about is our relationship to nature. Are we the rulers or are we the servants?
Right. So that's a deep question. How do we relate to nature? And the first 2 chapters of Genesis give different messages about that. Genesis 1:26 and 1:28 talk about human beings dominating the creation and conquering the earth, which is, from an ecological perspective, a little bit difficult to swallow. However, the rabbis of the Talmud talk about those verses in their context. And first of all, the context is one of where people were vegetarian, because 2 verses later in chapter 1, verse 30, God tells people eat plants, and the next verse God tells animals eat plants, and it was so. So the dominating of animals was not about eating them, not about killing them, and not about 80 billion animals in factory farms, which is what we have today, but perhaps using them to plow fields, using oxen to plow fields. It was also, when God said that to people to dominate and conquer, God said that to Adam and Eve, which were 2 people. They were 2 people amidst the entire earth. And that's a very different situation than humanity today. You know, people are drilling 40,000, 50,000 feet underneath the Earth's surface to access oil. The level of extraction, the level of dominance of nature that we have today is unparalleled. And so I think we need to, reconsider that. But the rabbis in the Talmud already 2,000 years ago were already saying that, for example, chapter 1, verse 28 says that we're made in the image of God. And so only if we act in the image of God are we given dominion over earth. But if we act in a way that's arrogant, then we're not given dominion, and rather the rabbis say that the animals rule over us. We only rule over animals if we act as righteous people. If we act as cruel tyrants over nature, then the animals will rule over us. And that's what's happening with coronavirus. It's a zoonotic disease. It's an animal-based disease that emerged from an animal market in Wuhan, China. And that's part of the human domination of animals that exists today.
And that's because we've basically taken up a lot of the land that the animals would have used. And now, since they have nowhere to go, they started to go into the human population centers.
Yeah, so according to a number of scientific studies, the human encroachment on nature, especially in forests and rainforests, is causing diseases that once were only deep in those places to come into human populations. There are studies about Ebola and the transfer there, and it's likely that the coronavirus transferred from a bat, and it went from a bat to an intermediate species like a pangolin, which is like a spiny anteater. And from there it got to people. So, we are one with nature. Everything's interconnected. As long as we dominate nature in a way that's unhealthy, then what comes around goes around. This is the cosmic karma of creation. We will harvest what we plant. And if we plant 80 billion animals in cages, then that's going to come back to us.
That was all predicted in the Torah.
Yeah, I mean, the ancient teachings of the Torah, of the Hebrew Bible, are becoming more and more relevant today with sustainability. If you read some of the prophecy from the prophets, you can see, they talk about ecosystem collapse, but because of human wrongdoing, that, the way that we act has an effect on nature, and we're, the species that changes nature, but we need to be very careful of how we act. And God has given us these, these brains, this pincer grip with our hands, which is unique in creation. But we have to remember that God is one, and that we're doing everything in service of the source of all life, and not for our own egoism and our own personal self-gratification.
So there was this idea of bad stewards. Cain was a bad steward, and Egyptians were bad stewards. And what happened to them? I guess this is part of the kind of warning that the Bible gives to people when they don't know how to take care of the land.
Yeah, I mean, we know the Bible makes clear what happens to the Egyptians. God sends Moses, the prophet, to tell Pharaoh to stop enslaving the Israelites. That it's not just, it's not what God wants. And then God brings these 10 plagues. Now, they didn't have to be 10 plagues. Had Pharaoh listened after the first one, the turning of the Nile into blood, then God would have stopped. Then the Egyptians would have been okay. But then Pharaoh refuses to let them go. And then the frogs come. And from an ecological perspective, the frogs are an indicator species. They indicate when an ecosystem's out of balance. And that just happened because the river turned to blood. So the frogs who live partially in the river went from the river onto the land and into Egyptian society. In our times, the frogs are also an indicator species. Many of the frogs in the world are dying as the planet heats up. People can, at least in the global north and the Western world, can live in air-conditioned places when it gets to be extreme heat. But when the heat rises, frogs feel it because they both live in water and on land, and they feel that the rising of the water temperature and the rising of the surface, the air temperature. And there's been a mass die-off of frogs in these early stages of climate change. So, the Bible's teaching us something deep about how do we live in balance.
Right, and that we're in the first plague or the second plague.
Yeah, I think so, and we have the ability to change. We can change our ways now, but we need to see the signs. This hurricane season in the Atlantic and Caribbean has had 27 named storms. That's the first time in recorded history that there have been so many storms, and about 6 of those hurricanes have hit Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida Panhandle. And I just saw a quote from someone who lived, and they just experienced about 5 hurricanes, and they said, "I'm packing up my stuff and I'm getting out of here. This is not a place where I can live anymore, because I'm not gonna every 2 weeks hunker down and get smashed by a hurricane and lose all my possessions and then do that again 2 weeks later." And so, but that's not happening to everyone now. But it's really time to wake up, and it's also just amazing to me after these elections that how the people in those states just reelected political leaders who deny climate change. And it's like,
it's amazing to me too.
Like how can it be, to get smashed by 6 hurricanes and then to deny that there's because this didn't happen, and people who are, in their 70s and 80s know that this is totally new. This has never happened before.
Right. Or the people in Alaska who reelect leaders who deny climate change, but yet they're living in the first place where they could see it.
Yeah, it's a big question. I don't actually have a good answer to this, of why people who are on the front lines of climate change and even climate refugees, why they vote for politicians who deny that there is such a thing as climate change, when it's like right in front of their eyes. Half of America is experiencing drought this year. Last year, the Mississippi River flooded, and the Missouri River in the most intense way in 100 years. Wow.
Well, maybe it has to do something with this quote from your book. The environmental movement that has sprung forth from the West bears many imprints of the thought paradigms that have led to the environmental crisis itself. There's a tendency to rush toward results and overlook the process required to organically arrive at the results. That is a strong connection with ourselves and the earth. So do you think that because we're missing that connection or that faith, is that why people deny it?
Well, it's interesting because the people in America who live closer to the land, who live in rural areas, tend to vote for political leaders that deny climate change. Those people also tend to be more conservative and more religious. And that actually goes back to a deeper issue. See, I think the ecological crisis is not a crisis of the birds and the bees or the trees and the toads. It's a crisis of the human being and how we live as spiritual beings in a physical reality. And therefore, it's really a crisis of religion, because most clergy in America don't speak about climate change, according to a study from the Pew Research Institute. Although, according to this Pew study, when clergy do speak about climate change, it mobilizes people to take action. So I think part of the reason why climate denial is so strong among many Americans is actually about religion. There's many people who say, well, first of all, only God can change the climate. People can't do that. That's like a theological principle that people got somewhere. However, in the Jewish tradition, it says that there's a midrash that says that God showed Adam and Eve all the trees of the Garden of Eden and said to them, see how beautiful and praiseworthy are my works. Everything that I created for you. Be careful not to destroy or degrade my world, because if you do, there will be no one after you to repair it. So, a lot of religious people, whether they're Jews or Christians or Muslims, doesn't really matter which religion, believe that the Messiah will come, God will essentially wave a wand, and somehow the Messiah or God will deal with all the plastic in the ocean and the carbon in the atmosphere, and it'll just all go away somehow. When I read scripture, I don't see that isn't written clearly anywhere. And
Right.
I'm not willing to put the future of my children at risk in the event that theological principle is wrong.
Have you found a lot of clergy around the world agree with your point of view and are trying to work toward a different outcome?
I have indeed. Pope Francis wrote an encyclical, a book called Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home, which is a very powerful ecological theological manifesto. The head of the Orthodox Church, with 300 million members, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I, wrote an encyclical on care for creation 30 years ago. The Dalai Lama cares deeply about these issues. He says that it's more important that we address climate change than that we, free Tibet, for example. The Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs writes about sustainability from a Jewish perspective. Thich Nhat Hanh, another leading Buddhist figure, wrote a love letter to the earth. So the spiritual leadership in humanity is saying with a loud and clear voice that we need to take action, that we need to mobilize. This is top priority. And the scientific community, 97% of climate scientists are saying that we need to take action. The question is, will humanity actually take action? And that's the challenge we're facing. Every year emissions rise. Every year plastic in the ocean increases. Every year biodiversity loss increases. The question is, at what point are we going to actually say, this is top priority, let's make it top of mind, and let's vote this way, let's act this way, let's really commit to a sustainability revolution?
So I think one of the prescriptions that you have for people to actually act is to find their connection with the earth. Like, for instance, Jacob slept outside and he found his connection with God. So do you think that perhaps if human beings reprioritize where their happiness comes from, that they could start to make changes?
Definitely. And first of all, I'm so grateful that you read my book. Thank you for doing so. Look, just to sit on the earth is an important thing to do. And many of us don't do it. Just to go out every day and to sit on the ground, not on concrete, not on bricks or stone, but to sit on the earth. All the more so to go camping for a few days a year and to actually lie on the earth, to sleep on the earth, even if it's on a pad. These are important things. These are things that our ancestors did, that Abraham, when God told Abraham to come into the land of Israel, he said to him to walk the width and breadth of the land, l'orka u'lerochba. So, God didn't tell Abraham to, make sure that you're doing all the religious ritual to the T. God said to Abraham, go into nature, see how beautiful the land of Israel is that I gave you. And also with Jacob, his dream of the angels ascending and descending at the ladder occurs when he's sleeping alone in nature. It's an important thing to do, to sleep in nature, to sleep alone in nature. It's an experience that can help to increase a person's level of faith in God. I remember when I was studying here in yeshiva in a Jewish studies center, before Passover, I went for a week into the desert by myself. And I remember the first night sleeping there, and I felt scared. There were jackals, there were maybe people that I might be afraid of. But I went to sleep that night saying, God is one. I trust in God. There's no police to protect me there. I was deep in the desert, and ultimately I had to have faith in God. And that's a way that being in nature can actually increase one's spirituality. And that was the case for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right. And especially the desert, it's an amazing experience to be in the middle of the desert at night and look up at the stars.
Yeah, it's a very humbling experience to see the stars and to see hundreds of stars, which you can't see hundreds of stars in a city, but in the desert, in nature, to see hundreds of stars and to realize, wow, it's possible that there is life outside of Earth. These are all solar systems. I'm seeing thousands of solar systems. I'm just this tiny speck here on this tiny planet in this one solar system. Like, who am I? Who are we to degrade this creation? And on the other hand, maybe this is the only life in the universe. Maybe God has put us, a unique distance from the sun for us to be, and this is the only life that exists in the entire universe that God created. And if so, who are we to send humanity and all of creation, on the Anthropocene, on a great extinction event where we could potentially extinct all life for tens of millions of years. There may not be life again like this for tens of millions of years. And who are we to do this if this is the only life in creation? I mean, this is a theological issue. This is about God. This is about God's creation and how we live on God's creation. And do we protect it? Do we make it a priority? Or is the most important issue abortion? Right. Is that being pro-life means being pro-sustainability? We have to think about all those fetuses that are saved from abortions will come to live on a planet ravaged by climate change. And so if you're about being pro-life for protecting those fetuses, you got to be pro-life for enabling those fetuses to live sustainably here.
Yeah. So there's a few sort of because I studied in Orthodox yeshiva when I was a teenager. So I know that there's a few things in the book that I think are going to be a little bit new as to what's emphasized in those studies. And one of them is a plant-based diet. Every Shabbat, Jews have to cook some kind of meat or fish meal to celebrate Shabbat. So that's kind of endemic to the culture. And in the book, you bring up numerous authorities and you advocate very strongly for a plant-based diet. How did this come about? And I know some of the authorities are pretty mainstream, like Rabbi Kook, Rashi. So it wasn't always this way that Jews would have celebrations with meat or eat meat every Shabbat.
Yeah, the current practice of eating meat and eggs and dairy at almost every meal, one of those, or fish at every meal, both during the week and during the Sabbath, that's a new practice. People didn't eat eggs like this, for example, until the past 60 years. It was only in 1956 that scientists were able to develop vaccines and antibiotics that were given to chickens. Prior to that, if you put thousands of chickens in one shed, they would die from, the same virus and the same bacteria. So therefore, that's for example why the egg is on the Seder plate. The egg is on a Seder plate, according to one opinion, because according to Rabbi Gil Marks, because in Roman times, the Romans would begin a festive meal with an egg, usually a goose egg. That's because having an egg at a meal was a delicacy. It was a rare thing. So you would start a festive meal, and in this case for Jews who adopted that practice, a Seder meal with an egg. The Torah only mentions eggs in relation to being in the wild, like found on a tree. It doesn't talk about domesticated chickens. They didn't domesticate chickens in the time of the Bible. That's why the Bible doesn't talk about it. And so therefore, when I go to a chicken shed outside of Jerusalem, and I see thousands of chickens in a shed, living above their own feces. Their own feces are stacked several feet high. They're living in a cage that they'll never leave. I have a spiritual experience. I smell this stench of feces of thousands of chickens. I look at them, and it's a spiritual experience for me because I experience the opposite of what God wants on this planet.
Right.
To me, it's like there are very few times in my life when I look at something that is clearly evil. Baruch Hashem, praise God. The people I know in my life are good people. And yet, when I see a chicken shed or when I see a cow shed with, hundreds or thousands of cows standing in their own manure, crowded in, never exercising, I think to myself, what in God's world are we doing? And how can it be that there is a kosher certification on this product? Because the Torah says that we need to be compassionate to animals. The psalmist said, Tov Adonai lakol v'rachamav kol ma'asav. God is good to all, and God's compassion is on all of God's works. So therefore, the human being is supposed to emulate God, and we're supposed to be compassionate to animals. And so how could it be that this milk or this meat or these eggs are considered kosher? Well, so according to Rabbi David Rosen, who is a teacher of mine who lives in Jerusalem, is former chief rabbi of Ireland, one of the leading rabbis in interfaith work in the world, who meets with the Pope and met with the King of Saudi Arabia last year. According to him, such products are not kosher. If they abuse animals in the process of creating them, it's not kosher. Kosher means fit. Kosher means appropriate. That's the literal meaning of kosher. And something that involves the abuse of animals is not kosher. That's the simple, and there are hundreds of rabbis that have signed on to a statement of veganism, saying that we need to return to the vision of Genesis chapter 1, verse 30, where God said to people, eat plants. And Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook said, this vision should not be lost for all times. Rather, it should return. And he wrote that in 1903. And in our times, it's possible to be vegan and to be healthy.
Right. So the other kind of side of this is eating with intention. So that you talk about in the Echo Bible about eating slowly, about knowing where your food comes from, and how Jacob was the one that ate with intention, and the reason why Esau was able to sell his birthright is because he did the opposite of that. He didn't eat with intention, so it was just something to satisfy him, and he would really give away the most precious thing that he had just to have a meal.
Yeah, can you just do you have the verse there for that? If not, it's okay. But that's an important teaching, which is a teaching about food ethics that we learn from Jacob and Esau. Right? Esau's porridge, the lentil soup of Esau. And
that soup must have been really good.
Yeah, it definitely must have been a good soup. So the question is, why should we eat in holiness? Well, according to some of the rabbinic sages, we learn that from Jacob's eating and from Esau's eating, because Esau, his name means Esav, which means asui, means already done, like as if he's already, it's like he's already eaten. He's not in the process, but he's in the act of eating. He's just about finishing. He's just about getting to the place of satiation, but he's not about actually being in a place of the now, the here and the now. And so that's part of the avodah, the spiritual work of Judaism is being in the here and the now, being in the moment. So just to sort of summarize, Esau comes back from the field and he's famished, he's hungry. And he says to Jacob, who'd just been cooking lentils, give me some of that red lentil porridge that you made, that stew that you made. And Jacob says to him, well, sell me the birthright, because even though they're twins, Esau was born right before him. He came out first. And so Jacob says to him, well, sell me the birthright. So Esau does that, and he agrees to sell the birthright to Jacob. And the verse in the Torah says, give me some of that red suba, and the language that the rabbis pick up on is the word haliteni, which can mean pour down to me. That word is used in the Talmud in reference to force feeding a camel or force feeding a goose in our times, like they do for foie gras. So the language that the Torah uses for Esau pouring this down his throat is a language of eating quickly. That he just wants to be full. He just wants to be satiated. He isn't chewing his food. He's just pouring it down his throat. And in this act, he forfeits the birthright. It's interesting because the next verse in the Torah says that there was a famine in the land. So there's also something to be learned about this unholy eating of Esau that the Torah is describing, and the rabbis understand to be unholy eating, and then the land doesn't have any food. It's as if if you despise the food, if you don't appreciate it, then there's not going to be food in the land, and that seems to be one of the things that's happening with Esau. So the opposite of that is eating in holiness, and so the word in Hebrew for ochel, for food, le'achol, to eat, is an acronym of ocha, is ech kama lama. How do we eat? How much do we eat, and why do we eat? How do we bring consciousness to our consumption? And a lot of that relates to food. What type of foods do we eat? Do we eat, compassionate foods toward animals and the earth? Do we eat a mostly plant-based diet? Do we eat slowly? Do we eat with other people? Do we chew our food many times? Do we eat slowly? Do we try to calm ourselves before we eat? That's how we, move from a binge to living in a holier way.
What was the birthright that he actually sold?
Well, according to Genesis, being the firstborn was gave the firstborn a certain blessing and inheritance from their parents. It's something that we don't have as much in our society today, but this was a big deal that Esau agreed to sell the birthright for a bowl of porridge.
Okay. So the other concept, which I found perhaps almost revolutionary in the context of Jewish orthodoxy or Jewish tradition, is the limit on population. So you basically talk about how, because we're in a climate emergency today, there's strong support in the Torah for people to limit the amount of children that they're having. And generally speaking, that's not what Orthodoxy teaches us.
That's correct. The mainstream view is that we should have as many children as we can. And that's why Israel has the highest population growth of any country among the OECD countries of Europe and Israel. And yet, the question is, how many people does God want on this planet? And how many people is sustainable, which is perhaps a very important related question. We live in a time of incredible human population growth. When I was when my grandfather was born in around 1890, there were 1 billion people. When my father was born in 1940, believe there were 4 billion when I was born in 1980. There were about 6 billion, and now there were close to 8 billion, and my son is 10 years old. My daughter's 5 years old. When my son is the age of my father, there will be around 11 billion people. And there's also cities in the world today. Cairo has about 30 million people. Guangzhou, China has about 45 million people. Tokyo has 36 million people. Here in Israel, there's 2 million people living in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area, 2 million people living in Gaza, approximately about 1.5 million people living in Jerusalem, Ramallah, and Bethlehem, which is essentially one urban strip. The question is, does God want us to continue to have as many children as possible? I mean, the command in Genesis of be fruitful and multiply is given to Adam and Eve when there were 2 people here. And so therefore, and according to Jewish law, the fulfillment of the command of be fruitful and multiply is to have 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl. And it's interesting because in the first chapter of Exodus, there's parallel language as the first chapter of Genesis. And it says that the land of Israel, the Israelites were fruitful and multiply and teemed and increased greatly, and the land was filled with them. So the question is, what is the Torah teaching in this parallel language between the first chapter of Genesis, where it says, be fruitful and multiply, and the first chapter of Exodus, where it says, and they were fruitful and multiply, and they filled the land. So archaeologists understand that there were about 3 million people maximum in Egypt in the time of the Torah. Perhaps 1 million of them were Israelites. So when the Torah says that the Israelites filled the land, it's referring to 1 million people in the land. And yet Egypt today has 100 million people. They're adding 1 million people every year. And so I think it's important theological question for clergy to ask today of, is the command that was given to 2 people, Adam and Eve, operative when we're nearing 8 billion people and we're heading toward 11 billion people, and when with our current population we're already causing the widespread degradation of nature? And so I'm putting this question on the table. I realize that it's a controversial question for Jews and Christians and Muslims and Hindus and others, but look, if we continue to ignore this question and sort of make it as a sacred cow that we're not willing to touch it, then I think that our children and grandchildren will suffer as a result.
Yeah, there's so many factors, but unfortunately, not all people can have children, and today, more than ever, science has made it that even people who couldn't have children could have them. So it feels like it's going to become more and more of a problem.
Well, I mean, the main population growth in the world is among religious people. Within secular society, there's actually a decrease in population, but it just so happens that most people in the world are religious, and that's why the population is expanding. So, in relation to what you're referring to of how, with technology, people who might have been infertile in the past, or gay and lesbian couples who in the past, if they were in a gay relationship, wouldn't have had children, but so they are having children. But that's not contributing to the main population growth. The main population growth is among religious families of many faiths who are having, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15 children per family. And then there's also some, polygamous families of where there's one man and, 4 or 5 women, where there are 30 or 40 children per family. That also exists in the world today.
Right. So I think the Torah also, according to the Echo Bible, talks about so many ideas that we have today about making our time on the planet more sustainable. And that one of those is sustainable forestry.
Yeah, so there we do, as part of the Eco Bible, we talk about sustainable wood consumption, sustainable forestry. That's definitely one of the important topics.
And another topic is sustainable energy. And what I actually found really interesting was that the Lubavitcher Rebbe advocated for solar energy in 1981, which was very prescient for that time. And I think you also talk about the date tree and how the date tree is supposed to guide us in how to collect that solar energy and make it renewable.
Yeah, so I understand that you're in Brooklyn, and in 1981 on Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn,
Mm-hmm.
the Lubavitcher Rebbe went out with his Hasidim, his students and his followers, and he gave a 45-minute talk on the blessing of the sun. There's a once in 28-year event of where Jews make a blessing to God in appreciation for the sun. And at this time, in 1981, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, said that God is showering on us, or God is bestowing on us this abundant solar energy. And we have the ability to harness that energy and use it to produce electricity using solar photovoltaic cells, which existed back in the 70s and the 80s. And the Rebbe said that if the US were to do that, the US could power the entire country from the solar panels just in the US Southwest, like Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. And the Rebbe said this after the 1970s oil embargo by Arab countries. And the Rebbe said that it was plainly ungrateful to not use this energy. It was ungrateful to God because God is giving us this blessing. So why should we be dependent on oil from other countries where they can use that for political leverage when we can just generate our energy from the sun? And so, this is something the Rebbe said 40 years ago, and it's possible now. In Israel, they get about 10% of the electricity from renewable energy. In some countries like Denmark, they're planning to go to 100% renewables in the next 10 or 20 years, largely from wind power. But also Germany has deployed a tremendous amount of solar energy. They helped lead the solar revolution. Solar is now going to displace coal in the United States as one of the energy sources. And at the same time, the world still uses about 82% of its energy mix from fossil fuels. And so even though renewables have increased and have grown, solar and wind, but people are still using a tremendous amount of gas and oil and coal. And so we need to fasten this transition. We need to hasten it.
Well, that's another thing that I wanted to ask you. So people that aren't decision makers in the fossil fuel industry or in Congress or in other parliaments, they don't necessarily want to use fossil fuels, but they're forced to by our society. So what do you say to those people? How to, because at some point people give up and they say, well, since I can't do anything about this, I can't do anything about anything else. So I'm just going to live my life and not worry about it. So what do you say to those people?
Well, each of us can make a difference. That's an important Jewish idea, that the individual has power. Each of us has power, and we can exercise that power. So, and how we live our life it represents an exercise of our power. So, for example, how do we commute to work? How do we get our groceries? How do we get our food? These are all things that many people have some say over of, do we use public transportation? Do we bicycle? And then also, how much do we fly for work or leisure? It's easy to get a $99 ticket to Cancun, but there's a tremendous carbon footprint from doing so. So the question is, how much do we decide to limit our carbon footprint? Over the past 7 months of the pandemic, people have drastically reduced their airplane travel, and that has drastically reduced the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere from airplanes. And the question is, there are tremendous beautiful places within a 20-mile radius of where most people live that they haven't been to, or that they haven't been to recently. So instead of going to Cancun or Puerto Vallarta, we can go to these beautiful nature places near us, and we don't have to get on an airplane, because most people don't even like flying. It's a hassle. Especially now, you have to wear a mask. It's, and we can, so that's one, practical way that we can change our energy consumption.
Yeah, I think Airbnb was talking about how most of their business is now coming from a 20-mile radius of someone's home because people aren't flying, and they thought their business would collapse, but instead people are going nearby and visiting places they haven't visited next to where they live. So I guess that's a positive change from the coronavirus.
Yeah, very interesting. It's, definitely, I didn't realize that about Airbnb, but they're the biggest hotel chain in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So surprisingly, the Torah also talks about the triple bottom line in business, meaning caring about the environment, caring about society, and then caring about profits. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So the triple bottom line, sustainability, society, and monetary profit. The rabbis talk about the importance of a market economy, but the market economy that the rabbis talk about in the Talmud is different than the current capitalist system that we have today. One thing that's different relates to advertising. The 10th commandment of the 10 commandments is do not covet. Do not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's donkey, etc. And so there's a religious value in not coveting things that you do not need. Now, in our times, there's a huge advertising industry which is trying to convince people to buy things that they may not have otherwise thought that they needed. For example, to buy a new smartphone every year because the new model has a better video camera on it, and that therefore I need the new model, even though it costs $1,000. That's one example of how there's a culture of consumerism that's trying to get us to buy things we don't need. And so religious values can help to rein in some of the excesses of our current system. That I actually think that the only institution in the world today that is capable of shifting direction from our current path is religion, because religion is about caring for another. It's about altruism. As Rabbi Michael Lightman said, altruism is spirituality. Caring for another person, wanting to be a net giver instead of a net taker, that is the definition for Rabbi Lightman of spirituality. It's not about, ritual. It's not about other things. It's about how much do we care for others. And therefore, an ecology, ecological sustainability, is also a lot about how much do we care beyond ourselves. That Rav Kook talked about the fourfold song, that there's one person who thinks about themselves and their own future. There's another, and there's another person who thinks about their nation, and there's another who thinks about creation. There's a fourth who thinks about the whole cosmos. And so I think the ecological crisis is asking us to shift to a higher level of spiritual awareness. Each of us has 5 levels of soul according to the Kabbalah: nefesh, ruach, neshama, achia, yechida. And these 5 levels, and a consumer society operates at the lowest level, but as we raise our level of spiritual awareness, we will be able to enable a more sustainable system. And actually, Rav Kook says that when humans do this, then we're actually going to raise up the animals so that the animals will be at a similar spiritual level as humans are at now.
But what about that original Jewish businessman, Abraham?
So you're asking about Abraham as a businessman?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Because I think that some of our listeners will be business people, and they would like to know how to incorporate these ideals into their business, because it's not that easy when you don't know that much about it. But Abraham was an example of a businessman that actually looked to the triple bottom line, right?
Mm-hmm. Good. So Abraham according to the rabbis of the Talmud, Abraham was very concerned not to graze his sheep and goats on the farmland of farmers, and of anything where he would inadvertently steal by taking the crops of people without paying for them. So Abraham was very committed to business ethics. Abraham was also committed to sustainability. The Torah says that the land of Israel was not able to sustain both Abraham and Lot. So instead of overgrazing the land with the tremendous flocks that they had, Abraham said to Lot, we need to part ways. We can't have our flocks together. And so Lot decided to go to Sodom. And Abraham decided to go to the land of Israel, to Hebron, to Beersheba. So that's another example of Abraham's committed to sustainability. And in our times, there's a whole movement for business sustainability. Maybe you've heard of B corporations. These are corporations which are committed to sustainability principles. And there's a lot of significant businesses. There are hundreds of businesses that have now signed on to the B Corporation pledge to care not about just the financial bottom line of how much profit you give to your shareholders, but also these bigger concerns of social and environmental ESG.
Absolutely. So what would you say to people who are just living their everyday lives but want to adhere more closely to these principles of ecology and purpose that are coming from what the Bible tells us? What are some of the things that they can do to make their lives more meaningful and also save the planet?
Well, first of all, I'd say get yourself a copy of Eco Bible Volume 1. Because in the book, we have hundreds of suggested action items. So, in this session, I'm not going to be able to share all of them, but members of our team, including Rabbi Leo D. and Fagel Hadassah Train, have been really helpful with these action items. And composting is one thing that we can do. We can about half of our waste matter is compostable. So if someone has a personal compost or a building compost, community compost, there's some municipal composts. That's one way we can reduce our waste stream. We can also practice rethink and reconsider instead of reduce, reuse, recycle. Some people think recycling is the end all and be all of being an environmentalist, but actually, if we rethink, do I even need this? Do I need to order takeaway now that's gonna, someone's gonna deliver to me on a motorcycle or a car, and then it's gonna come in all these disposable things with condiments I'm not even gonna eat, and with disposable silverware. So we can reconsider. That's an important ecological, spiritual message as well.
So yeah, one thing that blew my mind during the pandemic is that people had delivery of iced tea or some kind of drink in the plastic packaging to our building, just one drink. Somebody was delivering from the store because they didn't want to go to the store, but also they didn't want to make the iced tea at home. That was just mind-boggling.
Yes, indeed.
I think these are kind of all the topics that I wanted to discuss. Is there anything else you want to share?
No, I really appreciate your reading Eco Bible and your having all these amazing questions about it. Thank you so much for our session together.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Okay, you too.
Okay. Oh, just